And
can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can
All
hear
right.
you. Yeah,
All right, just checking.
We're ready to go.
All right.
So tonight is the part 2 of the Reformation, and last week we talked a little bit more about Martin Luther, and then we talked about some of the other individuals who were involved in the Reformation movement. If everybody would mute their mics so we can hold down the background noise, that would be great. And so as we discussed, there were many people who were involved in the Reformation movement. Martin Luther is kind of the spear point, if you will, of the Reformation. But there were many others like Zwingli and John Calvin, and then there was John Knox in Scotland. All of these individuals were playing a part in, bringing an awareness to the problems that existed within the Roman Church at the time. And so tonight we're going to talk about the Roman Church's response to the Reformation. But before we get into it, my sources again are the same as they have always been. I want to talk a minute about the term Catholic and the term Protestant. The name Roman Catholic Church emerged over a period of time. Now, in the course, we began with the Apostolic Age, and during that time, it was just simply the church. And the term Holy Catholic Church is found in the Apostles' Creed that was written in the 5th century. Now, the word Catholic means universal. And so the term Catholic was applied because it spoke to the church being the universal church. But in time, it came to designate the Roman Church. And so that's kind of how that came to be. And you recall that we discussed the first and what is called the Great Schism of 1054 AD, and that was the first division of the church in history. And with that schism, the church was divided into the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The Eastern Church continues to this day, and it includes the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, when we went to Alaska on a cruise several years ago, we stopped in the city of Juneau, the capital. And we were just walking around, and there was a Russian Orthodox church in Juneau, Alaska. And so you'll find many of these Russian Orthodox churches up there. And the reason is because before Alaska became a state, it belonged to Russia. And there were Russian people living there, and their churches were there. And so the Russian Orthodox Church is still a part of the Eastern Church. The Western Church, on the other hand, was led by the Roman bishop who would become known as the Pope. The term Protestant first appeared in 1529 when the Emperor of Germany, whose name was Charles V, rescinded the provisions of the Diet of Speyer in 1526. And the Diet of Speyer banned Martin Luther's writings and declared Luther to be a heretic and an enemy of the state. And Luther was German, and Charles V, the German emperor, rescinded that, meaning that Martin Luther's writings were no longer banned, and it declared Martin Luther not to be a heretic or an enemy of the state. And on April 19, 1526, a protest rose up against Charles's decision, and it was led on behalf of 14 free cities in Germany and 6 Lutheran princes. who declared the majority decision did not bind them because they weren't a part of the decision. And those who made this protest became known to their opponents as Protestants, okay? And eventually the label was applied to all who held the tenets of the Reformation. The name was attached to the followers of Luther, the followers of Zwingli, the followers of Calvin. However, some in Holland and England and Scotland preferred the name Reformed. And so you'll see churches that call themselves the Reformed Church. And the Presbyterian Church, for example, was one of the first Reformed churches. And so it really, Protestant comes from the idea of protesting. And so this is how the idea of the Catholic versus the Protestant came to be. In the 16th century, the term Protestant referred primarily to the Lutherans and the Reformed churches. In England, in the 17th century, the word Protestant referred to, quote, Orthodox, unquote, Protestant. However, the Anglicans referred to the Baptists and the Quakers as unorthodox, okay? Now, you'll recall last week we talked about the Anglicans. The Anglican Church was the name that was eventually applied to the Church of England that was started by Henry VIII when he broke away from the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholics referred to everyone as Protestants except for the Eastern Church. Today, Protestant church groups, and I'm speaking generally, include Christian groups outside of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so we are a part, and I'm sure you know this, of the Protestant Church. Now, let's talk about the Roman Church's response to the Reformation. The Roman Church did not react suddenly to the Reformation in the 16th century. However, the energy and the zeal of the Reformation resulted in the Roman Church becoming defensive and respond aggressively against those who were involved in the Reformation. And this response is called the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And we're going to begin looking at this Catholic Counter-Reformation in the country of Spain. Because in Spain, the Reformation within the Roman Church began before Martin Luther. And it started with Queen Isabella. And if you're familiar with history, Queen Isabella was the queen when Columbus sailed and discovered the New World. And so when Queen Isabella began to rule in 1474, she began reorganizing Spanish Catholicism. And she had the support of the Pope, and her campaign was for holiness and to clean out the monasteries and the convents in Spain, to, bring them back to their original purposes. They demanded the renewal of monastic vows, and you'll recall the monasteries are where the monks were living. So they renewed the monastic vows. They enforced poverty among clergy. They emphasized the need for clergy to be educated, and they purged the monasteries of corruption and immorality. The Pope gave Isabella authority to use the Inquisition, and the Inquisition is a church court to enforce adherence to church doctrine and practices. Especially victimized were the Jews by the Spanish, as they were intolerant. And in 1492, again, the year that Columbus was sent or left to go to the New World, Isabella decreed that all Jews had to either accept Christian baptism or leave Spanish territory. As a result, over 200,000 Jews fled Spain, forfeiting their land, their possessions, and some even gave their lives. And so we see that even back then there was this anti-Jewish move within Christianity, unfortunately. The next group, or the next part of the Catholic Reformation, is the Jesuits. And I'm sure you've heard of the Jesuits. They were a new monastic order that emanated from the Catholics in Spain. The Jesuits were founded by Ignatius Loyola, who lived from 1491 to 1556. He was a Spaniard. He was a soldier, and he was wounded in battle. And before he was wounded in battle, he lived a life of luxury and pleasure. But after his wound, he dedicated his life to God and to the church in 1522. This led to the founding of the Jesuits in 1534, and the Jesuits movement was patterned after the military, and they responded to challenges and opportunities in the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuits' mission was threefold. Number one was education. Number two was fighting heresy. And number three was missions. Now, if we talk about just for a moment the fighting of heresy, that meant that they were fighting against the Reformation. Because what the Reformation was teaching people was that they were saved by faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ. Salvation was justification by faith. That's the terminology, justification by faith. And for the Catholic Church, that was not their doctrine. And so to teach justification by faith was considered a heresy. And so through preaching and teaching, the Jesuits regained control of parts of Germany and Central Europe for the Catholic Church. Now again, the way we live in our church world today, especially in the United States, the government does not control the church. Now, in Europe, the governments are very much part of the church. Back in these days, politics and the church were intertwined, and the Catholic Pope would often be considered on par with any of the emperors, whether it's Queen Isabella or whether it was Henry VIII or whether it was the emperor in Charles V or whether it was the emperor in France. The Pope basically ruled the continent with them. And many times they would not do anything unless the Pope gave them permission. And so as the Reformation began, there began to be ripples within the political structure as well. And so these emperors, in trying to hold on to their kingdoms, would employ the Jesuits to come and, through their preaching and teaching, try to regain control. And if they couldn't regain control, they would use other methods. And so the Jesuits' attacks against heresy meant attacking those people involved in the Reformation. The Jesuits had two weapons that they used to fight against the Reformation. The first one is called the Index of Prohibited Books. It was a list of books that Catholics were prohibited from reading, and they were designed to control the minds of the Catholics. And so you could not read these books. The second weapon was the Inquisition. And the Inquisition often included torture when confessions were not obtained or retraction of what was considered heresy was not achieved. So they would bring in someone and they would accuse them of heresy, which would have included teaching justification by faith. And to us, this is ridiculous because it is a core foundational belief. It's what we hold to, justification by faith. We are justified before God by our faith in Jesus Christ. But if they were accused of this, they would torture them until they either retracted, and if they didn't retract, most of the time they would be killed. If a person was found guilty by the Inquisition, the penalty was either imprisonment or execution. Rarely did the Inquisition court show mercy, and in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium, the Inquisition totally eradicated any reformed threat. And that's why those countries today are very much Catholic countries. Italy, of course, Rome is there, and the Catholic Church is headquartered there in Rome. Spain and Portugal, Belgium are all very highly Catholic countries. The next part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation is the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was a definitive Catholic response to the Reformation. And from 1545 to 1563, so almost 20 years, they had 25 sessions in which the Catholic bishops deliberated. The council conceded that the Reformation, that is Protestantism, resulted from the ambition, avarice, and cupidity of Catholic bishops. And basically all of those words mean the greed and the corruption of the Catholic bishops. So they recognized that. The council ordered the education and training of all clergy in established Catholic seminaries. In response to Luther, the council abolished indulgence selling, okay? So what was that? If you went to repent of your sin, your confession before the priest, you would have to pay them in order to receive forgiveness. And so they abolished that. Next, they listed and defined clergy obligations. In other words, this is what their job is. Next, they regulated the use of relics. Up to this point, and if you were to go to any of the large Catholic churches in Europe, you'll find these relics. And, they'll have stuff like this is a piece of the cross of Jesus. The Shroud of Turin is considered to be a relic. There's no proof that these things are legitimate, but yet people would put their faith in the relics. They also restructured the role of bishops. And so these were some of the things that the Council of Trent did. The Council of Trent also addressed doctrinal issues. The council rejected, listen to this, rejected justification by faith alone and promoted works as necessary for salvation. The council reaffirmed the 7 grace-conveying sacraments. So in the Protestant church, there are 2 sacraments, baptism, and we have a believer's baptism. That is, we do not baptize infants. We dedicate infants to the Lord like we did this past Sunday. But baptism is something that a person who has made a decision to follow Christ does. So it's a believer's baptism. But in the Catholic Church, it's still infant baptism. So it's baptism, confirmation, communion, penance, extreme unction, A lot of times that's called last rites. Ordination and marriage. Those are the means by which grace is given to a believer in the Catholic Church. The council reaffirmed transubstantiation. We've talked about that. It is the belief that when the priest blesses the bread and the wine at communion, that the bread and the wine actually become the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. They reaffirm transubstantiation and the sacrificial nature of Mass in rejection of all Protestant positions regarding communion. So what were the Protestant positions? Lutherans believe in consubstantiation, that is, that Jesus is in, with, and under the elements, and others believe that it is a memorial in remembrance of Jesus, and that is the position that we hold. But they reaffirm these things. And also, notice here the sacrificial nature of Mass. Evidently, and I'm not Catholic, I've never been Catholic, and someone that knows about this could speak to it when we talk about it. If I'm incorrect here, please correct me. That when the priest performs Mass, that they are actually in the communion sacrificing Jesus again. I'd like to hear if you know if that's correct. Next, the council declared that the Latin Vulgate was the only acceptable Bible and maintained that church tradition was equal in authority to the Bible. Now, again, that is much different than what the Protestant church believes. The Protestant church believes that the Bible is above the church, that the Bible is the only authority for faith and life for a believer. But the Catholic Church puts the church above the Bible. The next thing in the Catholic Counter-Reformation is called the 30 Years' War. The Reformation included religious wars in Europe, of which the last is known as the 30 Years' War, and it lasted from 1618 to 1648. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg put Lutheranism on a legal basis with Roman Catholicism in Germany. So the Peace of Augsburg put Lutheran faith and Catholic faith on equal footing in Germany. Under the Peace of Augsburg, the prince of each of the regions of Germany was responsible to determine the religion of his territory. Okay? Again, this is so foreign to the way we think. But if a prince was over an area, that prince was free to determine whether he was going to be Lutheran or Catholic, and everybody in that territory had to be either Lutheran or Catholic, depending on what the prince decided. Those who did not agree with the prince were free to immigrate to another territory. So you can see here, I mean, just think about it. If someone came in and says, okay, everybody in the state of Texas, we're all going to be Catholic now. But if you don't want to be Catholic, you can move. All right? So you would have some people who are very, gung-ho in their faith, and then you would have some people who weren't very gung-ho, and they would just say, oh, what the heck, I'll just be a Catholic. Okay? And so there was a lot of that going on. To maintain Catholic domination in southern Germany, the agreement required Catholic princes who became Lutherans to surrender their rule. Okay, so if a prince was a Lutheran and they lived in southern Germany, they had to surrender being a prince. Well, this resulted in war. The Peace of Augsburg did not include groups like the Calvinists, the Anabaptists, or other groups. The war began in Bohemia, which is in southern Germany, and it continued for 30 years, and it spilled over and involved all the major European powers. Then we have the Peace of Westphalia that ended the war in 1648 after a lot of negotiations. The treaty recognized Calvinism, Lutheranism, and Catholics as all legal religions. The war was harmful, however, for Christianity because of the way things were done, and the political leaders began to put faith aside and began to focus more just on secular issues. In other words, we're going to get away from all this religious stuff. Political leaders became more concerned with secular and self-serving matters, but the brutality of the war caused many people in Europe to question the validity of Christianity. In other words, how could a religion, a faith, be a true system when it resulted in such brutality, with such, killing? So the 30-year war really hurt Christianity, even though there was this fighting against Catholicism, fighting against trying to hold on to power, all of these things. So in summary, the Catholic Counter-Reformation institutionalized the Catholic faith and resulted in the Catholic Church coming to terms with its own faults. The Inquisition ended in 1854. So almost 200 years there was these trials by a church court in which people were executed or tortured or imprisoned. The Index of Prohibited Books ended in 1966. So up until, and I was born in 1958, and I remember days when if you, and I had relatives who were in the Catholic Church, and their Mass was done in Latin. Everybody would go to Mass, and the priest would be speaking in Latin, and no one could understand what he was saying because only the priest knew Latin. I went to my cousin's wedding, and it was all in Latin. Nobody understood a word of it. So it's interesting that things that took place in the 1500s, in the 1600s, was still going on into the mid-1900s. And finally, the Tridentine profession of faith set in stone the Catholic theological distinctives and rendered reconciliation with Protestants as impossible. And so that's what I've got for tonight, because the next section is totally going into modern era, and it was too much to get started tonight. But I wonder if you've got any questions tonight, if any of you have any insight with regard to Catholic Mass, and you can share with us, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, you said something interesting as far as Catholic Church, because my parents actually took me to Catholic Church, and everything was in Latin, and that's when I was 14, so 63, 67. That was 77, and they were still talking Latin in Catholic churches. So it was still a long part, but, the thing is, you go through the communion, you got confession and everything else that you do in the Catholic Church, but the thing I didn't like about it was the fact that I didn't understand anything. And it wasn't until I decided to read the Bible on my own that other things started to appear to me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was a totally different atmosphere. There wasn't the singing, there wasn't no music, and it was just you go in. There was communion though, But now, as far as what the communion represented, that was a good question. I can't really answer that because, again, everything was in Latin, so I didn't understand it.
Yeah. That's good. And I don't want to make it sound as though a person that's Catholic is not saved. Okay. My dissertation chair, her name was Karen Triber, and she was a Spirit-filled Catholic. And she told me that at her wedding, there was a message in tongues and interpretation. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So, I mean, we should not think that a person who is a practicing Catholic is not saved. I mean, faith in Jesus Christ is what saves us. And so, just like there are people who attend Protestant churches that may or may not be saved, there are people in the Catholic Church who may or may not be saved, okay? So I want to caution against throwing everybody into one basket and saying, well, if they go to that church, then they don't know the Lord. I think that would be a false assumption. I think that anybody who is desirous to know the Lord will make sure that they know Him. I believe that.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. When my dad passed away in 2007, they did the Mass for him in the same Catholic church, but everything changed. Everything was in English, and everything referenced the Bible, and there was a lot of talk about Jesus. So there was a transition or a change there over that time period.
Yeah, I do know that they have started doing Mass in English, and that's a great thing, you know.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Questions or comments?
I just like that it was totally a mind-blowing moment earlier for me whenever you said Protestant is protests, and I was like, oh, wow. So I never got that until just tonight. So that blew my mind.
Oh, good. Glad I could blow your mind.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we're all a bunch of protesters. Anybody else? All right. Well, God bless you all. Thanks for showing up. Tomorrow night, my plan is to talk about two Greek words that are very important, hagios and dikaios. And if you want to find out what those mean, you'll be in church tomorrow. There's a cliffhanger for you. All right.
Hey, Gary, Dave and I are going to be at the church in the morning and working on that roof as far as cleaning it up.
Oh,
so
okay, great.
Yeah, we'll be there at 8 o'clock.
Thank you so much.
Okie dokie. All right.
God bless you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.